We're going to be looking this morning at that very first Palm Sunday, as I hinted a moment or two ago. Can I just say, before we get into that, there appears to be something of a rumour going around that Claire and I are deliberately choosing complimentary items of clothing. We went out last night and realised we had matching jackets on. This morning we are both wearing green, so absolutely no truth in that rumour whatsoever. I think it's fair to say that journeys play a fairly significant part of our lives. We've all made some kind of journey to get here this morning. Your journey, like my journey, may have been slightly disrupted by the diversions and the roadworks going on just down the road at the top of Radcliffe Moor Road and on Bury Road. But journeys are something we are familiar with. It might be that journey to work or to school or to college or to the shops. It could be that journey if you're a certain age like I am, where you walk to the top of the stairs and then you wonder why you went up the stairs in the first instance. Journeys can be something that are kind of second nature. We kind of go into autopilot if you go through the same or follow the same route to your destination on a regular basis. You kind of do. You feel like the car kind of knows where it's going. Journeys can be simple, they can be straightforward, but journeys can also be a little bit complicated at times. Several years ago, about 20 years ago now, my sister and brother-in-law in the family decided to make the big decision to go and live in Germany. And so they'd been out there for a little bit of time, and Claire and myself and the boys, we decided that we were going to go and visit them. Now, can I just say at the outset of this little story that Claire does not do flying well. She's not so bad once she's in the air, but she can't cope well with taking off, and she can't cope very well with a landing. And we'd made the journey over to Germany, and that was relatively stress-free. The way home, not quite as much. On the way to the airport, we received a message to say that our flight to Manchester from Frankfurt had been cancelled. And that instead we were going to have to fly to Heathrow, and then from Heathrow up to Manchester. Now, because we were put on a different flight, it meant that the seats that we had originally didn't necessarily follow through, if you see what I mean. And particularly on this flight into Heathrow. But bearing in mind now, this is 2 times the takeoffs and 2 times the landing. And we'd been put onto this flight, and we ended up where I was sitting on one side of an aisle, Claire was sitting on the other side of the aisle, and the boys, Sam and Jacob, I think were about 10 and 8 at the time, something like that, they were sitting behind. So Claire was sitting there on her own. And as we were coming into Heathrow Airport, Claire did what she normally did. She grabbed the hand of the person next to her, which of course wasn't me. And this poor chap, who'd been sitting there quite happily minding his own business, suddenly had his hand grabbed by this woman, deranged woman you might say, sitting in the chair next to him. But what was really funny was I watched all this going on. And as the plane had landed and taxied up to the gate, and the fastened seatbelt sign was switched off, and I got up, I got my hand luggage, rolled up my newspaper, and I turned to this man and said, "Can I just say thank you so much for looking after my wife?" Not every journey goes the way that we anticipate or expect it to. And I guess that's the thing about journeys, that they move us, they surprise us, and they shape us. And this morning we're going to consider, as we know, it's Palm Sunday. And Palm Sunday was the beginning of the most extraordinary journey that's ever been taken. A journey unlike any other in human history. Not a journey of convenience, not a detour, Not an accidental path, but something that was deliberate, intentional, and sacrificial. And that was Jesus' journey to the cross. Luke tells us something pretty remarkable in chapter 9 and verse 51. He says, as the time drew near for him to ascend to heaven, Jesus resolutely set out for Jerusalem. Notice that word, resolutely. It means determined. It means purposeful. It means unwavering. At this moment, Jesus wasn't just going to travel from town to town, from village to village, responding to whatever comes next. Jesus isn't drifting. He's not reacting. He isn't wandering. At this point, he is heading somewhere. He's stepping towards something. He's walking towards his own death. And remarkably, he's doing it willingly. Think about that for a minute. And we think about Palm Sunday. We think about the crowds lining the streets. We think about them laying their palm branches on the floor. We think about them shouting, Hosanna, as we'll read shortly, filling the air like the sound of victory. But Palm Sunday is far deeper than just some kind of festive parade. Palm Sunday is about purpose. It's about surrender. It's about a love that's so committed, so fierce, and so unstoppable that it keeps walking, ultimately, to the cross. Just before we read the story from Matthew, it's worth remembering this. Jesus isn't swept along by the enthusiasm of the crowd. He's not there to seek public approval. He isn't riding some kind of wave of popularity into Jerusalem. What he's doing is this. He's following God's plan. He's following his timetable, his perfectly crafted timetable. He's moving towards that very mission to which he came. Doesn't seem 5 minutes since we celebrated Christmas, does it? He had to come into the world, but why? He came into the world ultimately to die. And on this day that we know we've been reminded as the start of Holy Week, Jesus isn't taking a casual journey. He's taking the journey. He's taking a journey that would change the way that love would be redefined and would open the way for you and me to be reconciled to God. So with that in mind, we're going to read the story together. We're going to join with those crowds lining the road, listening to their shouts, to their experience, to their hopes. Let's see what this king is really like. The king who comes not to take a throne by force, but to take up a cross in love. Let's read together from Matthew chapter 21, verse 1. It says this: As they approached Jerusalem and came to Bethphage on the Mount of Olives, Jesus sent 2 disciples, saying to them, Go to the village ahead of you, and at once you will find a donkey tied there with her colt by her. Untie them and bring them to me. If anyone says anything to you, say that the Lord needs them, and he will send them right away. This took place to fulfill what was spoken through the prophet. Say to daughter Zion, See, your king comes to you, gentle and riding on a donkey, and on a colt, the foal of a donkey. The disciples went and did as Jesus had instructed them. They brought the donkey and the colt and placed their cloaks on them for Jesus to sit on. A very large crowd spread their cloaks on the road, while others cut branches from the trees and spread them on the road. The crowds that went ahead of him and those that followed shouted, Hosanna to the Son of David. Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. Hosanna in the highest heaven. When Jesus entered Jerusalem, the whole city was stirred and asked, Who is this? The crowds answered, This is Jesus, the prophet from Nazareth in Galilee. I want us to think at 4 key things in the time that we have this morning that Palm Sunday presents us with. First of all, there's the expectation of the crowd. The expectation of the crowd. I want you to picture the scene. Matthew tells us that the crowds have gathered. The city's buzzing. And people are putting their cloaks on the floor. They're cutting branches from the trees. And they are shouting, as we read in verse 9, Hosanna to the Son of David. Hosanna to the Son of David. Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. Hosanna in the highest heaven. Palm branches had become something of a symbol in the Jewish culture of nationalism and victory. A little bit like waving a national flag, I suppose. They were used in previous Jewish revolts as symbols of triumph. So the crowd waving palms wasn't just them simply celebrating. They were declaring, here comes our King. And you might ask this morning, Hosanna is maybe a word you've sung before. Maybe you sang it at school. Maybe you've read the verses before. Hosanna, what does that actually mean? Well, it means this, quite literally. Save us. That was the original meaning of Hosanna. Essentially, it was a people's cry for deliverance. It was their way of saying help in the day of trouble. It's an oppressed people's cry for their Saviour and King. But what did the people actually want saving from? The truth is they wanted a military hero. They wanted a liberator. They wanted a political king. Somebody who would come along and overthrow the Roman grip on them. They wanted a Messiah who would fix their circumstances. But Jesus came to fix their hearts and ultimately fix their relationship with him. Imagine going to the doctor and you've been suffering for a while and you say to the doctor, Doctor, can you give me something for this pain? And the doctor says, well, I could give you something for the pain, but ultimately, in the long term, it's not going to solve anything. What you need is surgery. What you need is a long-term solution. Yeah. On that day, the crowd were crying out for temporary relief. Yes. But Jesus came to give them a long-term hope, an eternal hope and future and purpose. And if we're honest this morning, we often think the way the crowd thought. We might say, God, can you fix my marriage? God, can you fix my job situation? God, can you fix this relationship? God, can you just fix my life? But God says, I've come first to fix you. All those things come later. And Palm Sunday asks us, are we following Jesus for who he truly is? Or for what we want him to be? There was the expectation of the crowd. Then there was the humility of the king. Matthew 21 reminds us of a prophecy found in the Old Testament in the book of Zechariah. Chapter 9, verse 9. Let me read it again to you. Rejoice greatly, daughter Zion. Shout, daughter Jerusalem. See, your king comes to you, righteous and victorious, lowly and riding on a donkey, on a colt, the foal of a donkey. Let's just pause for a minute and take that in. A donkey. Not a stallion. Not a war horse. Not somebody on a dazzling chariot. If Jesus had wanted to make some kind of political statement, those are the things that he would have chosen. Yes. And what does he choose? He chooses a donkey. He chooses a symbol of peace, of humility, of service. We've seen quite a lot in the news recently about the world leaders coming together, and you can have your own opinions on decisions that they make. They fly around the world, don't they, in their private jets, and they turn up in their cavalcade of cars. Just imagine if one of those leaders turns up riding a bike. It's that kind of effect, isn't it? And people would say, what kind of leader is this? And that would have been true on that day too. It would have made headlines if that were to happen, but mostly because it breaks all kinds of expectations. But that's what Jesus was doing. People on that day were saying the same. What kind of leader is this? And as Jesus rides into Jerusalem on this donkey, he's doing so, or as he's doing so, he's kind of preaching his own silent message. I've not come to dominate. I've actually come to deliver. I've not come to crush my enemies. I've come to rescue them. I've come to redeem them. I've come to forgive them. I've come to save them. That's our King. That's our King. Do you know, true power is not found in force. It's found in humility. True greatness is not found in status, but in surrender. And Jesus came to Jerusalem in humility, in dignity. And instead of coming on a horse, he came on a donkey. He didn't come as a conquering general. He came on a colt, as was customary for royalty. Let me read you just a few verses from the Old Testament. King David, who is on his deathbed, is making arrangements for his son Solomon's coronation. 1 Kings 1, verse 33. And he, that's David, said to them, take your Lord's servants with you and put Solomon my son, listen to this, on my own mule and take him down to Gihon. There shall Zadok the priest and Nathan the prophet anoint him king over Israel. Blow the trumpet and shout, long live King Solomon. Then you are to go up with him, and he is to come and sit on my throne and reign in my place. I've appointed him ruler over Israel and Judah. See, it wasn't unusual for a king to come riding on a donkey, but it was very much an act of peace, of humility, and as authority as a king to travel in that way, as opposed to the military power that would have been symbolized by a war horse. It was a peaceful arrival rather than some kind of conquest. And when Jesus arrived in Jerusalem, he was coming as the Prince of Peace. Do you know, I wonder what would happen in our homes or our workplaces or even in our church if we embraced a similar humility to what Jesus showed on that day. I suspect we'd forgive more quickly. I guess we'd listen better. I guess we'd serve without needing applause or praise. We'd lead with compassion and not control. Do you know what Palm Sunday reminds us of? It reminds us that we have a king who is humble, a king who is gentle, a king who is approachable, and a king who is interested in you and me. Third thing is this, the commitment of Christ. The commitment of Christ. Let me go back for a minute to that verse I read right at the start. Luke chapter 9, verse 51. As the time drew near for him to ascend to heaven, Jesus resolutely set out for Jerusalem. The closer Jesus got to Jerusalem, the darker that road became. What I find perhaps the most remarkable thing about the whole Easter story is that Jesus knew what was coming. He knew what was going to happen in those days that followed Palm Sunday. He knew he was going to be denied by Peter, that he was going to be betrayed by Judas, that he was going to be taken, go through a fake trial, that he was going to suffer a Roman scourging, that he was going to have a crown of thorns forced down onto his head, that his closest friends were going to abandon him, that he was going to be nailed hand and feet to a cross where he would suffer the most unimaginable pain. Do you know what? I think faced with that, I'd have done a runner. I don't know about you. He knew everything that was going to happen, and yet his focus remained on the cross. He didn't hesitate or negotiate. He didn't delay. He didn't try and put it off. I'll make this journey last a little bit longer. He didn't turn back. He didn't run away. He didn't choose comfort over calling. Why? Because the love he has for you and me kept him moving. Because you and I were on his mind. Because we were his mission. We were the reason he came in the first place. I may have shared this particular story with you before, but I think it fits perfectly with what we're trying to say. Many years ago, about 40 years ago, I did my O-levels. That shows you how old I am. I predate GCSEs. I beg your pardon. I did my English literature O-level, and I got a C, which doesn't sound that impressive, but given that I probably didn't read either of the books, I'm taking... Can I just say this morning, anybody that's doing their GCSEs this morning, that is not good advice. I think I got through my English literature exam, not because I read the book, but because I read the Pan study guide accompanying notes. And we did The Merchant of Venice, and we also did The Tale of Two Cities by Charles Dickens. But what I do remember about the story is the most significant part of the ending. This story, of course, is set in the French Revolution, 1789. A man called Charles Darnay is sitting in a prison cell awaiting execution for the crimes of his family. Another man called Sidney Carton, who bears an incredible resemblance to Charles Darnay, and also for many years has loved Darnay's wife, hears that Darnay's wife and children are also in danger. And so he arranges for them to cross the channel to get out of France. And Sidney goes to visit Charles Darnay in prison, and somehow convinces him to swap clothes with him. And then he drugs him unconscious. And Darnay is taken out of the cell, and Sidney Carton takes his place and has his life taken from him. Sidney Carton knew that entering that cell meant certain death. But because of the people that he loved, it was something he was prepared to do. Consider that in terms of Jesus, because that's what he did, except he didn't make the decision to die just for one person. He did it for the human race. He knew that walking into Jerusalem would lead to this outcome of crucifixion, because that was the plan. He wasn't pushed to the cross. He pursued it. He wasn't trapped. He was committed. He was not overwhelmed. Instead, he was obedient. We talked about the horrific events of that week, all that would happen to Jesus. But notice that the cross wasn't so much something done to Jesus. It was something that was chosen by Jesus. Listen to what John 10 says, verse 17. Jesus is speaking and he says, "The reason my Father loves me is that I lay down my life, only to take it up again. No one takes it from me, but I lay it down of my own accord. I have authority to lay it down and authority to take it up again. This command I received from my Father. Jesus was committed to the cross for you and for me. And that leaves us finally a choice, the choice before us. And this is where Palm Sunday gets personal. If you know the story, you'll know that the crowd on the Sunday were shouting Hosanna. But I guess many of that same crowd just a few days later were not shouting Hosanna, they were shouting crucify him. And you think, well, why? How does something like that happen so quickly? Well, because Jesus didn't meet their expectation. He disappointed them. The Messiah that they were looking for wasn't the one that Jesus was. So let me ask you this. If you're a Christian, are you only following Jesus when he meets your expectations? When it's comfortable, when it suits? Or will you follow him when the path leads to sacrifice? Matthew 16, verse 24, again, Jesus is speaking. He says this to his disciples, whoever wants to be my disciple must deny themselves and take up their cross and follow me. I want to make a comparison this morning. As you leave today, you'll be given one of these per family. A cross made out of palms. And can I make a comparison to you this morning? The Christian life isn't a palm-shaped life. It's a cross-shaped life. And you might say, what do you mean? Well, palm branches really symbolize comfort. They symbolize victory without cost. They symbolize a faith that doesn't disrupt our plans. And a Messiah who fits our preferences. Palm branches represent that part of the story where following Jesus feels fairly easy. It feels popular because everybody was doing it on Palm Sunday. They were all there shouting Hosanna. But that moment lasted just one day. Maybe you follow Jesus on a Sunday, that's your day. But not the rest of the week. Remember, just a few days later, the disciples were scattered. Even they scattered and disappeared. If you're married in here this morning, you'll have made some vows on your wedding day. And one of those things that you just said, apart from saying to love and cherish and honour or whatever it was you might have said, you'd have made a promise that through all life's circumstances, for richer, for poorer, in sickness and in health, you'd stick by your partner. But when it comes to one particular vow, I suppose you didn't say, I'm here for the better, but not so much for the worse. Following Jesus isn't always convenient. It's not always comfortable. It's not always being in the crowd like on a Sunday morning. Being a Christian sometimes is on our own, in our workplace, at our school, at our college, or wherever it might be. Following Jesus isn't always comfortable. It's not always popular. It's definitely not always easy. But you know what? It's always worth it. It's always worth it. Can I encourage you when you take this home, don't see it as a decoration. See it as a reminder. Reminder that following Jesus means choosing the cross even when the crowd have moved on. Let the cross that you take away today remind you to choose love when it's hard. Let it remind you that following Jesus is costly, but it's worth everything. So as we come to a conclusion, are we in it for the celebration? Or are we in it for the sacrifice too? Palm Sunday isn't the finish line. It's the start of this remarkable journey. It's the starting line, the start of a journey that leads to Good Friday and beyond. A journey that leads to a cross, to a spear in his side, to a borrowed tomb. And next week we'll celebrate the empty grave, the risen Saviour. But we can't encounter Easter Sunday without having first encountered Good Friday. This morning we don't just admire the cross, we respond to it. And as we do that, let it not be a shallow celebration as it may well have been for many on that day. This morning, as we consider Jesus, let it be out of surrender, commitment, and devotion. Just as we come to a close, let me ask you this. Are you following the real Jesus or a version of him that you've created? Are you willing to follow him into obedience and beyond celebration? Will you let him transform not just your situations, but your whole life, your very heart?